Welcome to Lore of Rings, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. In the depths of the Third Age, when shadow stretched long across Middle-earth and the Dark Lord's malice pressed against the borders of the free lands, there stood upon the weathered crown of Nazgûl a moment that would echo through eternity. Yet the tale that history remembers, of courage found in darkness, of small hands bearing impossible burdens, this is not that tale. This is the chronicle of the night the flame faltered, the story of what transpired when the Black Captain's blade found its mark, when the ring-bearer's cry was swallowed by storm and shadow, when the very foundations of hope crumbled beneath the weight of ancient malice. For in the archives of possibility, in the vast library of what might have been, there exists a darker thread. A world where the Nine did not retreat into mist and memory, but instead claimed their prize beneath the cold stars of Weathertop. The scholars of Gondor speak little of such things, for who would wish to contemplate the death of all that is good and fair? Yet Tolkien himself, in his letters and fragments, hinted at the knife edge upon which fate balanced that October night. One moment of hesitation, one stumble in the dark, 1 second's delay in Strider's arrival, and all the music of Arda might have turned to discord. What follows is that forbidden song, that chronicle of shadow triumphant. Draw close the curtains, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a tale that Middle-earth was never meant to remember. For tonight, we walk in the footsteps of a world that chose the darkness, and discovered that even in the deepest night, some small ember of hope might yet endure. The wind howled across the broken crown of Weathertop, like the keening of the dead, and perhaps it was, for death walked freely upon that ancient hill. Storm clouds had swallowed the moon, plunging the ruins into a darkness so complete that even the stars seemed to have fled in terror. In this lightless realm, 5 figures huddled around the dying embers of their fire, 4 hobbits whose courage had carried them farther from home than any of their kind had ventured in living memory. But courage, however bright, cast small shadows against the weight of ages. Frodo Baggins knelt beside the fading flames, his hand pressed against his breast where the ring lay hidden beneath mail and cloth. The metal burned cold against his skin, and with each heartbeat, he felt its hunger growing stronger, its whispers more insistent. Behind him, Sam Gamgee clutched his sword with white knuckles, while Merry and Pippin pressed close together, their young faces pale with the kind of terror that seeps into the very bones. They had felt the Black Riders approaching long before they saw them, a wrongness in the air, a weight upon the spirit that made every breath a struggle. Now, as 9 shadows materialized from the darkness like smoke given terrible form, the hobbits found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there would be no waking. The Witch King of Angmar, tallest and most terrible of the 9, stepped forward into the dying firelight. Beneath his iron crown, no face could be seen, only shadow and the faint gleam of eyes that had looked upon the fall of kingdoms. His voice, when it came, was like the grinding of millstones, like the whisper of burial shrouds. "The ring," he commanded, and the very stones beneath their feet seemed to shudder at the sound. "Give us the ring, and your torment shall be brief." Frodo's hand moved instinctively to the chain about his neck, and in that moment of weakness, the ring's power surged through him like poison in his veins. The world shifted, colors bleeding away, until he stood in the wraith world of shadow and flame. There he saw them truly, 9 kings in their dreadful majesty, their crowns still upon their brows, their royal robes now tattered shrouds. And there, burning upon the hand of their lord, was a ring of power that sang in harmony with his own. "I can see you," the Witch King whispered, and his terrible joy was like the laughter of winter storms. "There is no hiding now, bearer of Isildur's bane." Frodo tried to speak, tried to cry out for Gandalf, for Strider, for anyone who might stand against this tide of darkness. But terror had stolen his voice, and the ring's weight seemed to press him down into the very earth. Around him, his companions' voices seemed to come from a great distance, as though he were drowning in black water. Then came the moment that would damn all Middle-earth to shadow. The Witch King drew his blade, not the Morgul knife that history remembers, but his ancient sword, the very weapon he had carried as a king of men 9 ages past. Its edge gleamed with a light that was not light, a radiance that consumed rather than illuminated. As he raised it high, lightning split the sky, and for one terrible instant the blade seemed to hold captive all the stars of heaven. "For the 9!" the Witch King cried, and brought the sword down. In the world that was, Strider's torch would blaze forth in that moment, driving back the shadows with fire and song. The ranger would leap among the Nazgûl with flaming brands, and though Frodo would bear the wound of the Morgul blade, he would live to carry his burden further into the wild. But in this darker tale, no torch blazed, no ranger came. Strider was still leagues away, pursuing false trails in the darkness, and the hobbits faced their doom alone. The blade pierced Frodo's heart like winter lightning, and his scream was swung, aloud by the storm. The ring slipped from his failing fingers, its golden light dimming as shadow closed around it. There, upon the ancient stones of Amon Sul, the one ring of power came to rest before the armored feet of the Witch King of Angmar. Sam's cry of anguish echoed across the hill as he threw himself toward his fallen master. But the other Nazgûl moved like flowing darkness, their own blades gleaming in the stormlight. What followed was brief and terrible. The last free defenders of the Shire cut down like wheat before the scythe, their blood mingling with the rain that had begun to fall. As the Witch King bent to claim his prize, the ring seemed to pulse with a light of its own, not the warm gold of sunlight, but the cold radiance of stars reflected in still water. The moment his gauntleted fingers closed around it, the very air began to sing with a music both beautiful and terrible. For the Ring of Power recognized a new master, one whose will had been tempered in the fires of ancient kingship and hardened by centuries of service to the Dark Lord. The other Nazgûl drew close, their shadowed faces turned toward their captain with something that might have been hope. Had hope been possible for such creatures? In the Wraith world, they appeared as they once had been, 9 proud kings of men, their crowns still gleaming upon their brows, their royal raiment unmarred by time or decay. Yet now there was something new in their bearing, a sense of purpose that had been absent since the fall of their original master. "Brothers," the Witch King spoke, and his voice carried across the wind like the tolling of funeral bells. "The hour of our redemption is at hand. No longer shall we serve. Now we shall rule." As he raised the one ring toward the storm-lashed sky, lightning blazed forth as though summoned by his will. In that moment of illumination, every shadow on Weathertop seemed to deepen, every stone to whisper of ancient malice awakened, and far away, in the fallen tower of Barad-dûr, something stirred that had lain dormant since the last alliance. The Dark Tower had stood empty for 3,000 years, its master diminished to little more than a watchful shadow, but the ring's power, wedded now to the will of the Witch King, sent ripples across all the circles of the world. In the topmost chamber of Barad-dûr, where once the eye of Sauron had burned like a malevolent star, a new light began to kindle, not the fierce red of the original master, but something colder, more patient, infinitely more cruel. As the Nazgûl raised the One Ring to the storm, lightning flashed, and for the first time since Sauron's fall, Barad-dûr stirred once more. But this time, when the eye opened in its iron socket, it bore not one pupil, but two. One the fading remnant of the Dark Lord's will, the other something far older and hungrier, a malice that had festered in the darkness for countless ages, waiting for precisely this moment to claim its inheritance. In the deep vaults beneath Barad-dûr, where the very stones wept with accumulated malice, the air itself seemed to thicken as ancient powers stirred from their slumber. The Nazgûl had returned, not as servants bearing tribute to their master, but as conquerors claiming their inheritance. At their head rode the Witch King, the One Ring blazing upon his finger like a captive star, its light casting strange shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. The great gates of the Dark Tower, sealed since the fall of the last alliance, groaned open at their approach. No guards stood watch, no orcs bowed in homage. The fortress had stood empty for 3 millennia, a monument to defeated ambition. Yet as the Nine passed beneath its iron portcullis, the very walls seemed to pulse with renewed life, as though their arrival had awakened something that had long dreamed in the depths. In the throne room where Sauron had once held court, the Witch King paused before the great seat of black iron. Here, the greatest of the Dark Lords had planned the conquest of Middle-earth, had forged his ring of power in the fires of Mount Doom, had dreamed of dominion eternal. Now it stood empty, waiting for a new master to claim its authority. But the Witch King did not ascend the throne. Instead, he stood before it in silent communion with forces beyond mortal understanding. For within the ring, Sauron's essence still lingered, diminished perhaps, but not destroyed. The Dark Lord's spirit, bound to his creation by arts too terrible to name, found itself face to face with the will that would now command it. What passed between them in that moment was not a battle, for Sauron, reduced to mere shadow, lacked the strength to resist. Instead, it was a joining, a melding of malice that created something entirely new. The Witch King's ancient pride, his royal will forged in the youth of the world, merged with Sauron's vast knowledge and inexhaustible ambition. What emerged from that union was neither the fallen Maya nor the corrupted king, but a third thing, a consciousness that combined the worst aspects of both while transcending the limitations of either. Outside, the storm that had raged over Weathertop spread across all of Mordor, and with it came changes that would remake the very fabric of the world. The Nine had been transformed by their contact with the ring's new power. No longer mere wraiths bound to another's will, they had become something approaching their former selves, kings once more, though kings of shadow and nightmare. Each of the 8 gathered around their captain, and in the fitful lightning that illuminated the throne row, they appeared almost as they had in life, tall, proud, terrible in their majesty. The centuries of servitude had been burned away by the ring's fire, leaving behind only the essential core of their being, the hunger for dominion that had first made them vulnerable to Sauron's gifts. "My lords," the Witch King spoke, and his voice now carried harmonics that had not been there before. Echoes of the music of creation turned to discord. "The time of hiding is ended. The age of fear begins." From his finger, the One Ring pulsed with a light that seemed to reach into every corner of Middle-earth. In Rivendell, Elrond started from his meditations, his ageless face clouded with sudden dread. In Lothlorien, Galadriel's mirror showed only darkness, its surface rippling with images too terrible to comprehend. In the grey havens, Círdan felt the sea wind turn cold, carrying with it the scent of ash and ending. But it was in the Shire that the change was felt most keenly. Sam Gamgee had been found by the sunrise search parties, broken and bloodied beside the bodies of his companions, his mind shattered by horrors that no hobbit was ever meant to witness. The brave gardener, who had once dreamed of adventure, now sat rocking in his chair at Bag End, speaking only in whispers of shadows and flame, of his master's dying scream echoing across Weathertop. The rangers of the north rode hard toward Bree, Strider at their head, but they arrived to find only ashes and empty houses. The innkeeper and his guests had vanished in the night, leaving behind only the lingering scent of fear and a single message scrawled upon the wall in what might have been soot. The 9 have risen. Word spread swiftly through the wild lands, carried by birds that refused to fly south and by streams that ran backward toward their sources. Something fundamental had shifted in the balance of the world. Some great wheel had turned that could never be turned back. The free peoples sensed it in the air bones, a weight upon the spirit, a dimming of the light that had nothing to do with clouds or season. In Barad-dûr, the new Lord of Mordor raised his crowned head toward the window that looked out upon his realm. From this height, he could see the great forges rekindling, the vast war machines stirring to life, the endless armies of orcs and trolls emerging from their deep caverns. But more than this, he could feel the fear spreading across Middle-earth like ripples in a dark pond. The ring's power flowed through him like molten metal, showing him visions of the world as it was and as it could be. He saw the white city crumbling beneath his banner, saw the golden wood burning like a torch in the night, saw the grey havens choked with ash and the sea itself turned black with his dominion. All of this was within his grasp now, not as a servant executing another's will, but as a king claiming his rightful inheritance. Yet even as these visions of conquest filled his mind, something else stirred in the deepest chambers of Barad-dûr. In the eye that crowned the tower, a second pupil had indeed opened, not the fading ember of Sauron's consciousness, but something far older, far more patient. For the Witch King, in claiming the ring's power, had awakened not only his own potential, but something that had slumbered since the music of creation itself. In the beginning, when Eru Ilúvatar had sung the world into being, there had been discord as well as harmony. Melkor's rebellion had woven dark themes into the great symphony, creating possibilities for shadow and malice that would echo through all the ages of the world. Now, with the ring in new hands and its power turned to purposes that even Sauron had never imagined, those dark melodies were stirring once more. In the eye of Barad-dûr, a second pupil opened. Not Sauron's, but something far older, far hungrier. The void between the stars had found its voice at last, and it sang with the Witch King's will, promising dominion not merely over Middle-earth, but over all the circles of the world, over time itself, over the very foundations of creation. The Age of the 9 had begun, and with it, the longest darkness that Arda had ever known. 3 days had passed since the storm over Weathertop, and already the shadow of that night stretched its tendrils across all the wild lands of Eriador. In the hidden valley of Imladris, where time moved gently, and the songs of ancient days still echoed in the evening air, Elrond half-elven stood upon his balcony and watched the stars dim one by one. The Lord of Rivendell had lived through the Second Age and seen the fall of Gil-galad, had stood witness to the last alliance and the cutting of the ring from Sauron's hand. He had thought himself prepared for any darkness that might come, but the news that Glorfindel brought from the eastern borders filled him with a dread deeper than any he had known since the days of the War of Wrath. "They are coming, my lord," the golden-haired elf lord reported, his usual serenity cracked like ice upon stone. Not as wraiths fleeing from flame and water, but as kings in their full might. The very ground trembles beneath their march, and the trees turn away their faces, and will not speak of what they have seen. Below in the valley, the elves of Rivendell went about their daily tasks with growing unease. The fountains still sang, the bells still chimed the passage of hours, but there was a brittleness to their music now, as though it might shatter at any moment. Even the youngest among them could feel it, the change in the very air, the sense that something precious and irreplaceable was slipping away like water through cupped hands. Elrond closed his eyes and let his consciousness expand, touching the borders of his realm with the power that Vilya, mightiest of the 3 rings, granted him. For over 3,000 years, his ring had maintained the Hidden Valley's protection, weaving spells of concealment and sanctuary that had kept it safe from all the malice of the world. But now, as he reached out with his enhanced perception, he felt those ancient wards trembling like harp strings under tension. The ring-bearer was dead. This knowledge came to him not through any messenger or vision, but through the sudden absence in the world, a void where hope had once lived. Frodo Baggins, the brave little hobbit who had carried all their dreams upon his shoulders, was gone, and with him any chance of destroying the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom. Even worse, the ring itself had found a new master. Elrond could feel its presence like a weight upon his spirit, no longer the careful, patient malice of Sauron, but something more primal, more relentlessly cruel. The Witch King had claimed Isildur's bane, and in doing so, had become something that made even the original Dark Lord seem merely ambitious by comparison. "How long do we have?" Elrond asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They reached the Mythaithel at dawn," Glorfindel replied. "Their advance guard crossed the ford at noon. If they maintain their pace..." He paused, calculating. "They will be at our gates before the moon sets tomorrow." A day and a night. After all the long ages of peace, after 3 millennia of sanctuary, Rivendell had less than a day to prepare for a siege that would almost certainly end in its destruction. Around them, the other members of the White Council were arriving. Gandalf the Grey, his face grim with foreboding. Galdor from the Grey Havens, bearing news of ships that would not sail. Círdan himself, ancient beyond mortal reckoning, his blue eyes clouded with sorrow. "The paths to the west are closed," the shipwright reported. "Our vessels turn back from the straight road, as though the very sea rejects them. Ulmo's halls are barred to us, and the light of Valinor grows dim beyond the horizon." This was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. For generations, the elves of Middle-earth had taken comfort in the knowledge that when their time here ended, they could sail west to the undying lands and find peace in the halls of their kindred. Now even that hope was denied them. The Witch King's power, enhanced by the One Ring, had somehow severed the connection between Middle-earth and the Blessed Realm. They were trapped here, cut off from salvation, forced to face their doom without even the consolation of a noble end. Gandalf leaned heavily upon his staff, and for the first time in living memory, the wizard looked truly old. "I have been to Orthanc," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Saruman will not come. He speaks of accommodation, of treaties, of finding some modus vivendi with the new order. The White Wizard has forgotten his purpose, forgotten why we were sent to these shores." The assembled lords fell silent at this news. If Saruman, mightiest of the Istari, had abandoned the fight before it even began, what hope did they have? Elrond felt the weight of leadership settle upon his shoulders like lead, the responsibility for all the lives in his care pressing down until he could barely breathe. Yet there was no choice but to fight. Even if they could not win, even if their defeat was certain, they could not simply surrender all that was good and fair in the world without a struggle. The very stones of Rivendell cried out against such cowardice. The spirits of all who had found sanctuary here throughout the ages demanded that their refuge be defended to the last. Then we make our stand, Elrond declared, his voice ringing with the authority of ages. Let it be said that when the darkness came for the last homely house, it found not empty halls, but warriors ready to die for what they loved. The preparations began immediately. The ancient armories were opened, revealing weapons that had not been drawn since the War of the Last Alliance. Elvish blades that had tasted orc blood at Dagorlad were sharpened once more. Mail that had turned aside Sauron's darts was burnished until it gleamed like starlight. Even the youngest elves, those who had known only peace and song, took up arms with grim determination. But even as they made ready for war, all who dwelt in Rivendell could feel the shadow approaching. The very air grew thick and oppressive. The streams ran sluggish and dark, and the flowers in Elrond's gardens began to wither despite the gardener's desperate care. The Nazgûl's presence was like a canker in the world, spreading corruption wherever their feet touched the earth. The first sign of their coming was the silence. The birds that had sung in Rivendell's trees for countless generations suddenly fell mute, then fled westward in great clouds, as though fleeing some natural disaster. The deer and rabbits that had grazed peacefully in the valley's meadows vanished into the hills, leaving behind only empty grasslands that seemed to mock the elves' preparations. Then came the darkness. Not the natural darkness of night, but something thicker, more oppressive, a shadow that seemed to cling to everything it touched, draining color and warmth from the world. Even the elf lights that normally illuminated Rivendell's pathways flickered and dimmed, their radiance no match for the gloom that pressed in from all sides. Finally, at midnight on the second day, they came. The Nazgûl did not approach like a conventional army. Instead, they flowed up the valley like a tide of shadow, their forms barely visible, even to elven eyes. At their head rode the Witch King, and the sight of him struck terror into even the bravest hearts. He appeared now as he had in life, a king in his prime, tall and terrible, crowned with a circlet of black iron that seemed to drink in the light around it. Upon his finger, the one ring blazed like a captured star, its radiance somehow making the darkness deeper rather than dispelling it. The ancient wards of Rivendell, spells that had been woven by the greatest lawmasters of the Second Age, held for exactly 17 minutes. Elrond felt each protection fail in turn, the barriers of concealment first, then the walls of sanctuary, finally the innermost defenses that had guarded the valley's heart for 3,000 years. As each ward collapsed, a part of his own spirit seemed to die with it, until he stood defenseless before an enemy whose power dwarfed even Sauron at his height. The battle that followed was less a war than a slaughter. The elves of Rivendell fought with all the skill and courage of their immortal race, but they might as well have been children armed with wooden swords. The Nazgûl cut through their ranks like scythes through wheat, their ancient blades drinking deep of elvish blood, their very presence draining the life from their foes. Glorfindel, who had once faced a Balrog in single combat and lived to tell the tale, fell before the Witch King's sword without landing a single blow. Eristor, keeper of Rivendell's lore, died trying to protect the ancient texts in his care, his scrolls burning around him as the fires of Mordor consumed the House of Learning. One by one, the greatest elves of the Third Age met their doom, until only Elrond himself remained, standing alone in his ruined hall while the flames crackled around him. The Witch King approached slowly, savoring his victory. When he spoke, his voice held notes of triumph that made the very stones weep. "Lord Elrond," he said, and there was mockery in his tone. "Herald of Gil-galad, guardian Oas, of the Ringvilja, did you truly think your small magics could stand against the power of the One?" Elrond drew his sword, though he knew it was useless. "I am the son of Eärendil," he replied, his voice steady despite the flames that surrounded them. "I have stood against the darkness before, and I shall not yield now." "You have stood against Sauron," the Witch King corrected. I am no mere dark lord, seeking dominion through strength of arms. I am the void between the stars given form, the silence that follows the last song. Your defiance is as meaningless as the chirping of insects before winter. The final blow fell swift and sure, and with it, the light of Rivendell was extinguished forever. As the last homely house burned, its libraries consumed, its gardens withered, its songs silenced, the Witch King stood among the ruins and smiled. The greatest stronghold of the elves in Middle-earth had fallen in a single night, and with it, any hope that the free peoples might unite against the growing darkness. From the ruins of Rivendell, the Nazgûl carried with them more than mere treasure. They bore the sound of elven harps falling silent forevermore, the sight of ancient wisdom turning to ash, the knowledge that the elder days were truly ended. The light of the Eldar was passing from the world, and in its place came only shadow, only the cold wind that speaks of endings without hope of renewal. The great bell of Minas Tirith tolled 7 times, marking not the hour, but the number of days since the dreadful news had reached the White City. 7 days since a horse had stumbled into the Ramas Echor, bearing a rider more dead than alive, his eyes wide with horrors that had stolen his voice and left him speaking only in whispers of fire and shadow falling upon Rivendell like the wrath of forgotten gods. In the citadel's highest tower, Denethor, son of Ecthelion, lord and saint, Eward of Gondor pressed his palms against the smooth surface of the Palantir and gazed into its shifting depths. For 20 years, he had used the Seeing Stone to guard his realm, peering into distant corners of Middle-earth to watch for threats that might come against his people. But now, the ancient crystal showed him only darkness, not the absence of light, but something far worse, the presence of a malice so profound that it seemed to devour hope itself. "My lord," came a voice from behind him, and Denethor turned to see Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth standing in the doorway, his usual composure cracked like ice in spring. "The beacons. All of them have gone dark. From Amon Dîn to the Halifirian, not one flame burns upon the heights." This news struck Denethor like a physical blow. The Beacon Hills had been the lifeline of Gondor for over 1,000 years, a chain of signal fires that could carry news from the borders to the capital in a matter of hours. If they had all been extinguished simultaneously, it could mean only one thing. The enemy controlled every peak, every mountain pass, every route by which help might come to the beleaguered city. "What of our messengers to Rohan?" Denethor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "None have returned, my lord. The last rider to reach Adora spoke of strange shadows moving across the plains, of horses that would not cross certain streams, of the very grass withering beneath unknown feet. King Theoden has called his people to Dunharrow and sealed the passes of the White Mountains. He will not come." Denethor nodded grimly. He could not fault the Horse Lords for their caution. If their positions were reversed, he too might choose the safety of his mountain strongholds over a desperate ride to aid a realm that might already be lost. But the knowledge that Gondor would face this darkness alone settled upon his shoulders like lead, crushing the last of his hope beneath its weight. The Palantir pulsed with sudden light, and Denethor found himself drawn back to its surface despite his fear of what it might show. The Seeing Stone had been acting strangely since Weathertop, its visions more vivid but also more disturbing, filled with images that seemed to come not from the present world, but from some darker possibility that lurked just beyond the edge of reality. Now, as he gazed into its depths, he saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Osgiliath, the ancient capital of Gondor, the ruined city that guarded the crossings of Anduin, was no longer empty. Dark shapes moved among its broken towers, and from the highest dome, a banner flew that was not the Eye of Sauron. This flag bore a different device. 9 crowns arranged in a circle, each one bleeding darkness into the others, the whole design seeming to writhe and shift like a living thing. "They are not coming to conquer us," Denethor whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that moaned through the tower's windows. "They are coming to claim what they believe is already theirs." The realization struck him with the force of revelation. The Witch King and his 8 companions did not see themselves as invaders seeking to overthrow Gondor's rule. They saw themselves as the rightful kings of Middle-earth, returning after a long exile to reclaim their inheritance. In their eyes, Denethor was not a steward defending his realm, but a usurper squatting in halls that belonged by right to the Nine. This changed everything. An invasion could be resisted, its armies met in battle, its leaders perhaps reasoned with or bought off. But a return, a homecoming, that was something else entirely. Against such certainty, such absolute conviction of righteousness, what defense could mere mortal courage provide? "My lord?" Imrahil's voice seemed to come from very far away. "My lord, are you well?" Denethor shook his head, trying to clear the visions from his mind, but they clung to him like cobwebs, these glimpses of a future that seemed both inevitable and unbearable. He saw Minas Tirith's white walls stained black with smoke and blood, saw the tree of the kings withering in its courtyard, saw himself kneeling before the Witch King's throne while the great bell tolled for the death of hope. "Summon the captains," he commanded, his voice hoarse with strain. "All of them. Every man who can hold a sword, every woman who can draw a bow. Call in the guards from the outer folds, abandon the border posts, bring everyone within the walls of the city. If we are to die, let us at least die together." But even as the orders went out and the great horns of Gondor sounded the call to arms, Denethor knew in his heart that it was already too late. The enemy was not coming with orcs and trolls, with siege towers and catapults. They were coming with something far more dangerous, the absolute certainty that they could not be defeated. In the days that followed, as refugees streamed into Minas Tirith from every corner of Gondor, the city transformed from a beacon of hope into a fortress of despair. The lower levels filled with frightened families clutching their few possessions, while the upper circles were given over to soldiers who went about their duties with the grim efficiency of men preparing for their own funerals. Reports came in throughout those dark days, each one worse than the last. Ithilien had been abandoned without a fight, its rangers fleeing westward with tales of shadows that moved like water, and voices that spoke in languages that predated the creation of the world. Caer Andros had fallen in a single night, its garrison vanishing so completely that not even bodies remained to mark their passing. The great bridge at Pelennor was broken, its stones cast into the river by forces that no engineer could explain. Worst of all were the tales of those who had knelt, for not everyone fled before the advancing darkness. Some chose a different path, bending the knee to the Nine in hopes of preserving their lives and those of their families. These new subjects of the Witch King were not killed or enslaved, but transformed into something far more disturbing. Willing servants who spoke of their new masters with genuine reverence, who described the coming shadow as a liberation rather than a conquest. "They promise order," reported one captain who had barely escaped from Pelargia. "They say the age of war is ending, that under their rule there will be peace eternal. And my lord, some of our people believe them. Some of our people want to believe them." This was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. Denethor had prepared for siege and storm, for fire and sword and the death of hope. But he had not prepared for the possibility that some of his people might choose the darkness willingly, might see in the Nazgûl's rule a promise of safety that Gondor's kings had never been able to provide. Standing upon the walls of the citadel, looking out over a city that buzzed with fearful preparation, Denethor felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. For over 3,000 years, the line of stewards had held Gondor together, had kept alive the hope that one day the king would return and all would be made right. Now that hope lay buried beneath the ruins of Weathertop, and with it, any meaning to the long watch that his family had maintained. The Palantir called to him again, its surface shimmering with visions of what was to come. Against his better judgment, Denethor approached the Seeing Stone one final time, pressing his hands against its cool surface and opening his mind to whatever truth it might reveal. What he saw there broke the last of his resistance. Minas Tirith did not burn, it transformed. The white stone turned black as midnight. The banners of Gondor were replaced by the 9-crowned standard of the Nazgûl, and from every tower flew flags that proclaimed the end of the Third Age and the beginning of something far more terrible. The city's people went about their daily lives, but their faces were blank, their eyes empty of everything that had once made them human. And there, seated upon the throne of Gondor, in halls that had been built to honor the return of Isildur's heir, sat the Witch King in all his terrible majesty. Upon his finger, the One Ring blazed like a captive star, and around him knelt the lords of Gondor, their heads bowed in submission to the new order that had come to Middle-earth. As Denethor watched this vision of the future, he felt his sanity slip away like water through his fingers. The last steward of Gondor collapsed beside the Palantir, his mind finally shattered by horrors too great for mortal comprehension. When his guards found him at dawn, he was speaking in whispers of crowns and fire, of the great bell tolling for the death of the world. From the highest tower of Minas Tirith, a new banner began to rise, not the white tree of Gondor, but something far more ominous. A black banner that bore the device of 9 crowns arranged in a circle, each one bleeding darkness into the others. The great city had not yet fallen to siege or storm, but it had already fallen in the place that mattered most, in the heart of the man who was supposed to defend it. A black banner rises over Osgiliath, not the eye of Sauron, but the crown of the 9. And with it, the last hope of mortal resistance begins to crumble like sand before the tide of an inexorable darkness. In a small round door painted green, with a brass knob set precisely in its center, Sam Gamgee sat in his master's favorite chair and watched the seasons change beyond the windows of Bag End. Spring had turned to summer, summer to autumn, and now winter pressed close against the glass, with fingers of frost and shadow. Yet still he waited, though he could no longer remember exactly what he was waiting for. The healers from Bywater had done what they could for his broken body, setting bones and stitching wounds with the gentle skill that hobbits had always possessed. But there were injuries that ran deeper than flesh, wounds to the spirit that no herb or poultice could mend. Sometimes Sam would speak of fire and shadow, of screams that echoed across ancient hills, of his dear master falling beneath blades of starlight and malice. But more often, he simply sat in silence, his eyes fixed on horizons that only he could see. The Shire continued its peaceful existence, largely unaware of the darkness that was spreading across Middle-earth like ink through water. The hobbits of Hobbiton went about their daily business, tending their gardens, brewing their ale, gossiping over garden fences, about weather and crops and who was courting whom. If they noticed that the sun seemed dimmer than it used to be, or that the stars were fading one by one from the night sky, they attributed it to the changing seasons and paid it no more mind than the turning of leaves in autumn. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change in the Shire as well. The first sign was in the gardens. The vegetable plots that had always been the pride of every hobbit household began to wither despite the gardener's most diligent care. Potatoes rotted in the ground, carrots grew twisted and bitter, and the famous Shire tomatoes refused to ripen properly, hanging on their vines like pale, sickly lanterns. At first, the hobbits blamed the weather or pests, or some blight carried by the wind from the wild lands beyond their borders. Then the animals began to disappear. The sheep that grazed in the fields of the West Farthing vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty pastures and the lingering scent of fear. The birds that had sung in every hedgerow for countless generations fell silent, then were gone entirely, as though they had never existed at all. Even the fish in the streams and ponds simply disappeared, leaving the waters crystal clear, but utterly lifeless. The Great East Road, which had always carried a steady stream of travellers and merchants through the heart of the Shire, grew empty and overgrown. The few outsiders who did attempt to journey west found themselves turned back by strange mists that rose from nowhere, or by roads that seemed to shift and change when no one was looking. The Shire was becoming isolated, cut off from the wider world by barriers that none could see but all could feel. In Bywater, the miller's wheel stopped turning, though the stream ran as strong as ever. In Hobbiton, the children stopped playing their games of adventure and exploration, preferring instead to huddle indoors with their parents, speaking in whispers of dreams that felt too real and shadows that moved without cause. Even the Green Dragon fell silent, its common room empty of the laughter and song that had echoed there for generations. Sam noticed these changes more keenly than most, for his mind, though broken, remained sharp in its own fractured way. He had seen true darkness on Weathertop, had looked into the face of malice itself, and now he could recognize its touch, even in the smallest things. The way the light fell differently through Bag End's windows, the way the wind no longer carried the scent of growing things, but only the smell of endings. The way his own shadow seemed to whisper his name in voices he almost recognized. "They're coming," he would murmur to visitors, though fewer and fewer hobbits made the journey up the hill to check on poor Sam Gamgee. "They're coming for all of us, just like they came for my master. The dark is spreading, and there's nowhere left to run." Most who heard him assumed these were the ravings of a mind damaged beyond repair. But Widow Rumble, who brought him meals and tended to his basic needs, sometimes caught glimpses of something else in his eyes, a terrible clarity, a knowledge of truths that the rest of the Shire was not yet ready to face. The change came gradually, like the turning of the seasons, but somehow more final. Trees that had stood for centuries began to wither and die, their leaves falling not in the natural cycle of autumn, but all at once, as though some poison had been poured into their roots. The streams ran sluggish and dark, their water taking on a taste that reminded those who drank it of metal and ash. The very air grew heavy, oppressive, making every breath an effort and every step a struggle. And then, on a morning when the sun rose pale and sickly over the Shire, the travellers appeared. They came not as conquerors or invaders, but as pilgrims seeking a new home. Tall men from the south, wrapped in dark cloaks and speaking in soft voices about the glory of the new age that was dawning across Middle-earth. They brought gifts, gold and jewels and beautiful things that sparkled in the dim light. And they spoke of the great lords who had come to bring order to a world grown chaotic and wild. "The time of suffering is ending," their leader proclaimed in the market square of Bywater, his voice carrying strange harmonics that made even the most skeptical hobbits pause to listen. "The 9 kings have returned to claim their rightful thrones, and under their rule there will be peace eternal. No more war, no more hunger, no more fear, only the perfect order of subjects serving their natural masters." Some hobbits fled at these words, recognizing in them echoes of stories their grandparents had told about the dark times of old. But others, tired, hungry, frightened by the changes they could not understand, began to listen with growing interest. The strangers spoke of safety, of certainty, of an end to the confusion and fear that had been growing in the Shire like weeds in an untended garden. Mayor Will Whitfoot tried to maintain order, calling for town meetings and attempting to rally the traditional Hobbit spirit of independence, but his voice seemed thin and wavering compared to the confident tones of the dark-cloaked strangers. And each day, more hobbits began to gather around these new teachers, listening to their promises of a better world. Sam watched these developments from his chair by the window, his broken mind somehow able to see what others could not. He recognized the strangers for what they were, not men from the south, but something else entirely, servants of the Nine who had been sent to prepare the Shire for its new masters. Their words were poison wrapped in honey, their gifts were chains disguised as ornaments, and their promises were the whispers of predators luring prey into carefully prepared traps. But when he tried to warn his neighbors, his fractured speech and damaged reputation worked against him. Who would listen to poor Sam Gamgee, who had returned from his adventure with his mind shattered and his master dead? Who would believe the ravings of a hobbit who spoke to shadows and wept at the sight of falling leaves? The transformation of the Shire accelerated after that. The traditional festivals were replaced by new celebrations that honored the Nine Kings and their promise of eternal order. The old songs were forgotten in favor of hymns that praised the wisdom of submission and the beauty of surrender. Children who had once played at being rangers and elves now played at being loyal subjects, kneeling before their friends who wore paper crowns and spoke in the harsh accents of Mordor. Saruman arrived on a day when the sky was the color of old pewter, leading a column of soldiers who marched in perfect formation through the Shire's winding lanes. But these were not the wild orcs and Dunlendings that might have been expected. They were men, orderly and disciplined, who spoke politely to the hobbits they met and paid fairly for the supplies they requisitioned. "The Shire is now under the protection of the White Hand," Saruman announced from the steps of the mill in Hobbiton, his voice carrying easily to the crowd that had gathered to hear him. "You have been chosen for a great honor, to serve as an example to all Middle-earth of what peace and prosperity can look like under the rule of the wise. Your loyalty will be rewarded, your obedience will be cherished, and your children will know a world without the chaos and violence that have plagued these lands for so long." Some hobbits cheered at these words, genuinely grateful for the promise of safety and order. Others remained silent, uncertain but unwilling to speak against what seemed to be an inevitable tide of change. Only a few, Sam among them, recognized the terrible truth beneath Saruman's honeyed words. The Shire was not being protected but prepared, not being honored but domesticated, transformed from a place of free hobbits into a garden where tame subjects could be cultivated like prize vegetables. As winter deepened and the darkness pressed ever closer against the windows of Bag End, Sam Gamgee felt the weight of memory and loss settling upon his shoulders like a shroud. Somewhere beyond the borders of the Shire, the Nine Kings ruled from their dark thrones, their power growing stronger with each passing day. The world that his master had died trying to save was ending, replaced by something that promised peace, but delivered only the silence of the grave. Yet even in his broken state, Sam retained something that all the Witch King's power could not destroy: the stubborn hope of the Shire, the refusal to believe that any darkness, however complete, could last forever. In the deepest part of his damaged mind, he held on to the memory of his master's courage, of the moment when a small hobbit had chosen to bear an impossible burden rather than let the world fall into shadow. In Bag End's quiet window, Samwise saw his master's shadow, and it whispered his name, not in malice but in encouragement, reminding him that even the smallest light can shine in the darkest places, that even broken hearts can kindle flames that no wind can extinguish. The Shire might be forgotten by the wider world, its peace turned to prison, its joy transformed into the hollow contentment of the enslaved. But in one small round room, in one faithful heart, the ember of resistance continued to glow. The storm that raged over the misty mountains was like nothing Middle-earth had ever seen, not merely wind and rain and lightning, but something far more fundamental, as though the very foundations of the world were being torn apart and reassembled according to a darker pattern. At its heart, where the tempest's fury was strongest, two figures faced each other upon a precipice of stone that jutted from the mountainside like an accusing finger pointed at the tortured sky. Gandalf the Grey stood with his staff raised high, its crystal blazing with the white fire of Anor, the flame imperishable that had been kindled in the depths of time by the will of Eru himself. Around him swirled the winds of his power, not merely the magic of a wizard, but the true nature of a Maya revealed, one of the Ainur who had sung in the music of creation before the world was made. His grey robes snapped and billowed in the gale, but his stance was firm, his resolve unshaken despite the magnitude of the evil that confronted him. Before him rode the Witch King of Angmar, but not as he had appeared in the days of his servitude to Sauron. The One Ring had transformed him, burning away the last vestiges of his wraith-like existence and revealing the king he had once been, terrible in his majesty, crowned with black iron, his ancient blade gleaming with a light that seemed to devour the very concept of illumination. Upon his finger, the master ring pulsed with power that made the stones beneath their feet groan and crack, as though the mountain itself was in pain. Mithrandir, the Witch King spoke, and his voice carried harmonics that had not been heard since the music went awry in the beginning of all things. Grey fool, servant of the flame imperishable, did you truly think you could stand against the darkness that was promised before your precious light was ever kindled? Gandalf did not reply immediately. Instead, he reached deeper into the core of his being, calling upon powers that he had been forbidden to use since first he had taken the form of an old man and walked among the peoples of Middle-earth. The Valar had sent him to guide and counsel, not to match power with power, but those restrictions seemed meaningless now in the face of an evil that threatened to unmake everything he had been sent to protect. "I am Gandalf the Grey," he said at last, his voice ringing with authority that made the very air tremble. "Servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. I name you Witch King of Angmar, Kinslayer and Oathbreaker, and I command you to return to the void that spawned you." The staff blazed brighter, its radiance reaching out to touch the Witch King's darkness. For a moment, it seemed as though the ancient contest between light and shadow might be decided here, upon this windswept peak, as it had been decided so many times before throughout the long ages of the world. But this time was different. This time, the darkness did not retreat. The Witch King raised his blade, and where it met Gandalf's light, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the expected clash between opposing forces, there was a merging, a synthesis that should have been impossible. The ring's power, enhanced by its new master's will, did not simply resist the flame of nor it transformed it, turning white fire to grey ash, hope to despair, purpose to futility. "Your light is beautiful, Mithrandir," the Witch King said, and there was something almost like pity in his voice. "But it is also finite. It burns bright for a time, then gutters and dies, leaving only darkness behind. My shadow is eternal, patient, inevitable. It does not struggle against the light. It simply waits for the fuel to be consumed." Gandalf felt the truth of these words like ice in his veins. For 3,000 years he had walked Middle-earth, kindling hope in the hearts of the free peoples, standing against the darkness whenever it arose. But now, faced with an enemy whose power seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment, he began to understand the terrible scope of his failure. The Witch King was not simply another Dark Lord seeking dominion through force. He was something far more insidious, a corruption of the very concept of kingship itself, a perversion of the natural order that turned authority into tyranny, protection into oppression, justice into the cruel whim of absolute power. Against such a foe, how could the traditional tools of resistance hope to prevail? The wizard's staff began to dim, its crystal clouding as doubt crept into Gandalf's mind like poison. He had failed in his primary mission. The One Ring had not been destroyed. The Dark Lord's power had not been broken. And now something even worse had taken Sauron's place. All his long years of patience and guidance, all his careful nurturing of courage in mortal hearts, all his faith in the ultimate triumph of good over evil. What did any of it matter in the face of this absolute defeat? "I can see it in your eyes, old fool," the Witch King continued, his voice now gentle, almost compassionate. "The moment when hope dies. The instant when a guardian realizes that everything he has tried to protect is already lost. It is a beautiful thing to witness, the breaking of a Maya's will, the extinction of the flame imperishable." Around them, the storm began to abate, but not because the conflict was ending. Instead, the very air seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see which of these two ancient powers would prove stronger. In the distance, lightning still flickered among the peaks of the misty mountains, but even the thunder seemed muted, respectful of the momentous struggle taking place upon this isolated precipice. Gandalf tried to rally his failing strength, to rekindle the fire that had sustained him through so many dark days. He thought of Frodo's courage, of Bilbo's unexpected heroism, of all the small folk who had shown such extraordinary bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. But these memories, instead of strengthening him, only deepened his despair. Frodo was dead, cut down on Weathertop before his quest could even truly begin. The hobbits who might have been heroes were now slaves or corpses, their potential snuffed out before it could bloom. What was the point of remembering courage when courage itself had proven insufficient? The Witch King seemed to sense his opponent's wavering resolve. With a gesture of his ring-bearing hand, he summoned forth visions that played out in the storm clouds above them. Glimpses of the world as it was becoming under the rule of the Nine. Cities that had once blazed with life now stood silent and orderly, their inhabitants going about their daily tasks with the blank contentment of the perfectly enslaved. Forests that had once sung with the voices of birds and beasts now stood as silent as graveyards, their trees arranged in perfect rows like soldiers on parade. Rivers that had once danced and sparkled in the sunlight now flowed dark and still, carrying to the sea the ashes of all that had once been wild and free. "This is not destruction, Mithrandir," the Witch King explained, his voice now taking on the tones of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. "This is perfection, order imposed upon chaos, peace eternal, purchased at the small price of freedom. Your friends, your allies, your precious free peoples, they are not suffering. They are simply quiet, content, at rest." The worst part was that the visions held a terrible beauty. There was indeed peace in the world the Witch King showed him. No war, no strife, no uncertainty or fear. The children grew up safe and well-fed. The adults labored at tasks suited to their abilities. The elderly died quietly in their beds, surrounded by families who mourned them with appropriate restraint. It was everything that civilization claimed to strive for, achieved at last through the simple expedient of removing choice from the equation. Gandalf's flame flickered lower, his staff growing heavy in his trembling hands. For the first time in all his long existence, he began to question not just his mission, but the very principles upon which it was based. Was freedom truly worth the suffering it inevitably brought? Was the chaos of choice preferable to the peace of perfect order? Had he spent 3,000 years defending something that was ultimately more cruel than the darkness he opposed? "You begin to understand," the Witch King said, and his approval was like warm honey poured over a poisoned blade. The music of creation was flawed from the beginning, scarred by discord and disharmony. We do not seek to destroy that music. We seek to perfect it, to remove the jarring notes that cause such unnecessary pain. Submit to the inevitable, Mithrandir. Lay down your burden. Let the silence come. The wizard stood frozen between conviction and despair, his mind reeling under the weight of possibilities he had never before considered. Around him, the storm continued to rage, but it seemed now like the death throes of a dying world, rather than the fury of righteousness confronting evil. The flame of Anor guttered in his staff, its light growing ever dimmer as doubt consumed the certainty that had sustained him through all the dark years of his mission. And in that moment of ultimate crisis, when the White Wizard's will hung by the thinnest of threads, the Witch King struck. It was not a physical blow. His blade remained at his side, his posture unchanged. Instead, it was an attack upon the very foundations of Gandalf's being, a darkness that crept into the spaces between thoughts and transformed hope into ash, purpose into emptiness, love into the hollow echo of what once had been. The wizard's scream echoed across the mountains, a sound of such pure anguish that even the stones wept to hear it. When the echoes faded, Gandalf the Grey was gone. In his place stood a figure bent and broken, his staff shattered, his robes torn, his eyes empty of everything that had once made him a guardian of the free peoples. The Maya that had been Olorin in the Undying Lands, that had been Gandalf in Middle-earth, now knelt in the rain upon a mountainside and wept for the death of hope itself. The Witch King regarded his fallen foe with something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps merely completion. "And so ends the light of the West," he said, his voice carrying across the peaks like a funeral bell. "The last of the Guardians is broken, the final defender has fallen. Now let the true age begin, the age of perfect silence, of absolute order, of peace eternal beneath the shadow of the Nine." As he turned away from the broken wizard and rode back toward his waiting throne, the mountains themselves seemed to bow before his passage. The storm clouds parted like curtains being drawn aside, revealing a sky that was no longer blue but grey, a sun that shone with diminished light, a world that had forgotten how to hope. When the White Wizard fell, the stars themselves seemed to dim, as though Ilúvatar had turned his face away, unable to bear witness to the failure of his most faithful servant. In the deepest halls of Valinor, the Valar sat in council and spoke in whispers of endings that they had never foreseen, of music turned to discord, of light consumed by a darkness that was patient enough to wait for eternity itself to grow weary and surrender. From the pinnacle of Barad-dûr, now crowned with banners that bore not the eye of Sauron, but the nine-starred crown of the returned kings, the Witch King looked out upon a world transformed. The great tower rose higher than it ever had in the days of the Dark Lord's rule, its iron spires piercing the clouds like accusing fingers pointed at the very foundations of heaven. Yet for all its terrible majesty, the fortress no longer radiated the chaotic malice that had once marked it as the seat of ultimate evil. Instead, there was something far more disturbing, a sense of perfect order, of absolute control, of a peace so complete that it felt like death itself. The transformation had taken 7 years to complete, 7 years since the night when fire had fallen from the sky and hope had died upon the heights of Weathertop. Now, as the Witch King surveyed his dominion, he could see the fruits of that victory spreading across all the corners of Middle-earth, like ripples from a stone cast into still water. To the east, beyond the ash-shrouded peaks of the Ephel Duath, the lands that had once been Wild Rune now lay under the ordered rule of Kamul, the Easterling. The nomad tribes that had roamed those steppes for countless generations were gone, replaced by settled communities that lived in perfect harmony with their environment. The great rivers ran clean and straight, their courses altered by engineering works that boggled the mind. The cities rose in precise geometric patterns, their streets laid out according to mathematical principles that ensured maximum efficiency in all things. There was no hunger in Rune, no guabuku, and no uncertainty, also no laughter, no song, no dreams that reached beyond the careful boundaries of what was deemed appropriate. To the south, the burning deserts of Harad had been transformed into gardens that surpassed even the legendary fertility of the Shire in its golden days. The mouth of Sauron, elevated now to the rank of king in his own right, had turned his considerable intellect to the task of making the wasteland bloom. Aqueducts carried sweet water from hidden springs deep beneath the sand, while vast greenhouses sheltered crops that had never before grown under the southern sun. The fierce peoples of the desert still lived there, but their wildness had been channeled into productive labor, their tribal conflicts resolved through the simple expedient of removing any cause for disagreement. To the west, Saruman the Many-Colored had claimed dominion over all the lands from the Gap of Rohan to the shores of the Grey Havens. The White Wizard's betrayal of his original mission was now complete, his transformation from guardian to tyrant accomplished with a thoroughness that even his new masters found impressive. Isengard had become the center of a vast industrial complex that stretched across much of what had once been wild Eriador. The forests were gone, replaced by perfectly ordered plantations where trees grew in straight lines and produced exactly the amount of timber required for the endless construction projects. The rivers had been dammed and channeled to power the great mills, while the ancient roads had been widened and straightened until they formed a perfect grid across the landscape. In the north, the realm of Angmar had been restored under the direct rule of the Witch King himself, though he rarely visited those cold mountains in person. The ancient fortress that had once been the seat of his dark kingdom now rose again from its ruins. Its towers were as black against the grey sky. But this new Angmar was not the chaotic realm of evil that history remembered. Instead, it was a model of efficiency and order, where the descendants of the hillmen who had once served the Witch King now lived in neat villages and followed carefully planned lives that maximized their contribution to the greater good. The former lands of Gondor and Rohan had been divided among the remaining Nazgûl, each claiming a portion of the realm as his own hereditary kingdom. Minas Tirith still stood white upon its hill, but the tree of the kings had been uprooted and replaced with a garden where black flowers bloomed in perfect symmetry. The great bell no longer tolled the hours, for time itself had been regulated according to the will of the Nine. The Pelennor was now covered with houses arranged in precise rows, their inhabitants pursuing crafts and trades that had been assigned to them based on careful analysis of their aptitudes and inclinations. Perhaps most disturbing of all was what had become of Rohan. The Horse Lord's love of freedom and wide spaces had been deemed inefficient, their nomadic traditions replaced with a more settled way of life. The great herds of horses still grazed on the plains, but they were no longer wild. Each animal was catalogued, bred according to scientific principles, and trained to serve specific functions in the new order. The Rohirrim themselves had been relocated to permanent settlements where they could be more easily managed, their ancient halls converted into museums that preserved the memory of their primitive past. Yet for all the visible changes that had been wrought upon the landscape, it was the transformation of the people themselves that truly marked the success of the Nine's rule. There were no rebellions, no resistance movements, no desperate last stands by heroes who refused to accept the new reality. This was not because opposition had been crushed, but because it had been rendered unnecessary. The subjects of the Nine were genuinely content with their lot, grateful for the peace and security that had been purchased at the small price of individual freedom. In the great libraries of what had once been Minas Tirith, scholars worked diligently to compile the complete history of Middle-earth according to the approved narrative. The wars and conflicts of the past were recorded not as glorious struggles between good and evil, but as unfortunate episodes of chaos that had been resolved through the wisdom and beneficence of the rightful rulers. The hobbits were remembered as charming primitives whose simple nature had made them unsuited for the complexities of civilization. The elves were portrayed as beautiful but ultimately selfish beings who had withdrawn from the world rather than accept their responsibility to guide lesser races. Men were depicted as children who had finally found the firm but loving guidance they needed to reach their full potential. The transformation was so complete, so thorough, that within a generation there were few who remembered that things had ever been different. The children who grew up under the rule of the Nine knew no other world, and their parents, grateful for the security and prosperity that surrounded them, rarely spoke of the old days when life had been uncertain and dangerous. The very concept of individual choice began to seem not just primitive, but actively harmful, a relic of humanity's ignorant past that had caused nothing but suffering. In the reconstructed halls of Barad-dûr, the Nine held court with a dignity and ceremony that surpassed anything the kings of old had ever achieved. Ambassadors came from the far corners of the world to pay homage to the new order, bearing tribute and seeking the wisdom of rulers who had transcended the petty concerns of mortality. Trade flowed freely along roads that were always safe. Crops grew in abundance in fields that never knew drought or blight, and the arts flourished under the patronage of kings who had the leisure to appreciate beauty in all its forms. Yet there was something wrong with this perfection, something that nagged at the edges of consciousness like a half-remembered dream. The music that played in the great halls was technically flawless, but somehow lifeless. The poetry that was recited in the schools followed all the proper forms, but failed to stir the heart. The paintings that decorated the walls captured every detail of their subjects with photographic precision, yet somehow missed the essential spark that separated art from mere illustration. The world had become a vast machine, perfectly designed and flawlessly operated, producing exactly the results for which it had been created. But machines, however sophisticated, do not dream. They do not hope or fear or love or rage. They simply function, eternally and without variation, until the day when their purpose is complete and they can finally be still. The world grows quiet, too quiet, for even the trees have forgotten how to whisper. In the perfect silence of the Nine's dominion, where every voice has been stilled and every song has been reduced to approved harmonies, the very essence of what made Middle-earth a place of wonder and possibility has been carefully extracted and disposed of, leaving behind only the hollow shell of order without soul. In the heart of the Golden Wood, where time had flowed like honey through countless ages, and the very air sang with the memory of elder days, Galadriel, Lady of Light, stood beside her mirror and watched the world die. The silver basin that had shown her visions of what was, what is, and what yet might be now reflected only darkness, not the absence of light, but something far more terrible, the presence of an absolute order that drained meaning from existence itself. For over 7,000 years she had dwelt in Lothlorien, making it a sanctuary where the beauty of Valinor lived on in the mortal lands. The Leon trees had grown tall under her care, their golden leaves catching starlight and holding it like captured music. The celebrant and Celebdil had sung as they flowed through her realm, carrying with them the laughter of the Eldar and the promise that not all fair things must fade. Even the very grass beneath the trees had gleamed with an inner radiance, as though each blade were wrought from green flame. But now, as she gazed into the mirror's darkened surface, Galadriel could see the shadow spreading across all the lands of Middle-earth. The dominion of the Nine was complete, their rule established not through conquest, but through a transformation so fundamental that resistance had become literally unthinkable. Where once there had been the beautiful chaos of free will, now there was only the sterile perfection of absolute control. "My lady," came a voice from behind her, and she turned to see Celeborn approaching through the flet-bordered paths, his silver hair gleaming in the filtered light that fell through the golden canopy. But there was something wrong with the light. It seemed dimmer than it had been, as though the very Melian were losing their power to capture and hold the radiance of the stars. "The borders grow weak," he reported, his ageless features clouded with concern. "Our guardians speak of shadows moving beyond the celebrant, shapes that avoid our sight but leave traces of their passing. The very water runs sluggish and dark where it leaves our realm, as though something poisons it the moment it passes beyond our protection." Galadriel nodded, though the gesture brought her no satisfaction. She had felt the weakening herself, had seen in her mirror the slow erosion of the barriers that kept Lothlorien separate from the darkening world beyond. For thousands of years, her power, amplified by Nenya, the Ring of Water, mightiest of the three, had maintained this haven against all the malice that Middle-earth could muster. But now she faced an enemy that did not attack her defenses so much as render them irrelevant. The Witch King's dominion operated on principles that she was only beginning to understand. Instead of seeking to destroy the light, he transformed it, turning illumination into revelation of his own glory, hope into gratitude for his beneficence, love into loyalty to his rule. It was a corruption so subtle, so insidious, that by the time its victims realized what was happening, they no longer wished to resist. "Nenya grows cold upon my finger," she said, raising her hand so that the light fell upon the adamant that graced her ring. The gem that had once blazed with the captured radiance of the evening star now seemed pale, its fire dimmed to barely more than a spark. "The One Ring rules over all the others, and its new master's will presses against mine like a weight upon the spirit." They had known this day might come, of course. From the moment Celebrimbor had forged the rings of power in the ancient halls of Ostin-Edel, the three had existed in the shadow of the One. Only Sauron's fall at the end of the Second Age had allowed them to be used openly, and even then their wielders had known that their power would end when the Master Ring was destroyed. But they had never imagined this, that the One might find a new bearer whose will was strong enough to dominate theirs, whose malice was patient enough to wait for them to destroy themselves. For that was what was happening in Lothlorien. The golden light that had sustained the realm for millennia was being slowly but inexorably drained away, not by any external force, but by the simple fact that Nenya could no longer maintain its power in the presence of a ring-bearer who commanded its obedience. Each day the trees grew a little less luminous. Each night the stars seemed a little more distant. Each dawn brought the realm one step closer to the mundane reality that surrounded it. "Perhaps," Celeborn said carefully, "it is time to consider the path to the havens. The ships still wait in Mithlond, and the straight road yet remains open to those who—" "No!" Galadriel's voice cut through his words like a blade of starlight, fierce and final. "I will not flee to Valinor while darkness claims the world I have helped to guard. The Eldar came to Middle-earth to be its protectors, and I will not abandon that trust now, even if it means sharing the fate of all who dwell here." But even as she spoke these words of defiance, she could feel the truth behind them crumbling like sand. The mirror beside her rippled, its surface showing new visions that made her heart grow cold within her breast. She saw the Witch King approaching through the borders of her realm. But he did not come as a conqueror. Instead, he rode alone and unarmored, his terrible crown replaced by a simple circlet, his bearing more that of a pilgrim than a king. Lady Galadriel. His voice reached her across the impossible distance that separated vision from reality. Fairest of the Eldar, keeper of the light that was kindled before the world was made, I come not as your enemy, but as one who would offer you a gift beyond all price. In the mirror, she saw him dismount from his fell beast and approach her mirror on foot, his movements showing a respect that bordered on reverence. When he spoke again, his words carried no threat, no demand for submission, only a sadness that seemed to echo across the ages. You have been a guardian of beauty, a preserver of what is noble and fair in this world. But your light grows dim, does it not? The power that once sustained Lothlorien fades like a candle in the wind, and soon even this last refuge will be no different from the grey lands that surround it. Galadriel tried to speak, tried to reject whatever offer he was preparing to make, but found that she could not look away from the mirror's surface. The Witch King's words carried a terrible truth. She could feel Nenya's power ebbing like water from a cracked vessel, could see the golden light of the Meliran dimming with each passing hour. Soon, Lothlorien would be just another forest, its trees merely trees, its streams merely water, its people merely memories fading into the dusty archives of a world that had forgotten how to dream. I offer you a choice, the Witch King continued, and his voice now held notes of genuine compassion. Surrender Nenya to me willingly, and I will preserve Lothlorien exactly as it is now, golden and fair, filled with music and starlight, a haven where beauty never fades and sorrow never enters. Your people will know perfect happiness, and you yourself will rule here as you always have, lacking nothing, wanting nothing, free from the burden of watching everything you love slowly die. The offer hung in the air like incense, sweet and cloying and utterly poisonous. Galadriel understood what he was truly proposing, not preservation, but transformation, not salvation, but a kind of spiritual death that would leave the forms intact while draining away everything that gave them meaning. Her Lothlorien would become a museum, its inhabitants living exhibits in a display of what the elder days had looked like, their every word and deed carefully scripted to match some idealized version of elven perfection. And if I refuse, she asked, though she already knew the answer, then Nenya's power will continue to fade until it is no more than a pretty bauble upon your finger. Lothlorien will become like any other wood, and your people will face the choice that all others have faced. Submit to the new order, or fade into the grey shadow of a world where they no longer belong. Around her, the golden wood held its breath. The Melian trees stood silent, their leaves no longer whispering in the breeze. The fountains stopped their singing, the streams ceased their laughter, and even the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of impending decision. In the distance, she could hear the voices of her people, Celeborn's steadfast love, Haldir's quiet strength, Celebdil's ancient wisdom, all of them looking to her for guidance in this darkest hour. Galadriel closed her eyes and reached deep into the core of her being, seeking the light that had sustained her since the first dawn of the world. She found it there still, though it was smaller now, more fragile, like a candle flame in a hurricane. The power of Nenya was failing, yes, but the light of Erendil's star still shone within her. The gift of her grandmother Elbereth still sang in her blood. With a sound like crystal breaking, she pulled Nenya from her finger and held it high above her head. The ring blazed one final time, pouring out all its accumulated radiance in a single magnificent display that turned every leaf in Lothlorien to burning gold. For just a moment, the realm appeared as it had at the height of its glory, beautiful beyond words, perfect beyond imagining, eternal beyond hope. Then the light faded, and Galadriel cast the ring into the mirror's depths, Where it touched the water, steam rose like incense, and the silver surface cracked from rim to rim. Nenya sank into darkness and was gone, taking with it the last of the 3 rings and the final hope that the power of the Eldar might yet prevail against the shadow. The transformation began immediately. The golden light drained from the Meliorn like blood from a wound, leaving behind trees that were still beautiful but no longer luminous. The streams still flowed, but their song was gone, replaced by the ordinary sound of water over stone. The air grew heavier, more common, touched now by the weight of time that no elven craft could delay. But Galadriel hers, elf blazed brighter than ever, her inner light kindled to a flame that no darkness could extinguish. She had chosen to give up her ring rather than see it corrupted, had chosen to let Lothlorien fade rather than preserve it as a hollow mockery of its former glory. In making that choice, she had reclaimed something that all the Witch King's power could not touch: the freedom to choose darkness over false light, ending over empty eternity, truth over the comfort of beautiful lies. The Witch King's voice echoed across the ruined mirror one last time, and now it held no compassion, only the cold certainty of absolute victory. So ends the last light of the Eldar. So passes the final guardian of the ancient ways. You have chosen noble failure over ignoble success, and in doing so, have condemned not only yourself, but all who looked to you for hope. Lothlorien burned then, but not with the fires of destruction. Instead, it burned with the golden flame of a sunset, beautiful and terrible and final. The Meliorn became torches that illuminated the surrounding darkness for one brief, glorious moment before crumbling into ash. The streams boiled away into mist that carried with it the last songs of the elder days. The very ground opened like a flower and swallowed the ruins of the ancient realm, leaving behind only a circle of barren earth where nothing would ever grow again. And thus, the Lady of Light was the last to fall, her tears turning to silver upon the ash, her final song echoing across Middle-earth like a lament for all the beauty that the world had lost. In her destruction, she achieved a victory that all the Witch King's power could not deny, the knowledge that even in the deepest darkness, there remained those who would choose to burn like stars rather than gutter like candles, who would die as themselves rather than live as shadows of what they once had been. 200 years had passed since the last light of Lorien was extinguished, 2 centuries during which the very concept of counting time had begun to seem quaint and unnecessary. In the great archives of what had once been Minas Tirith, now renamed Barad Nuin, the Tower of the Nine, scribes worked diligently to record the details of a world that had achieved perfect equilibrium. Their chronicles spoke of harvests that never failed, of cities where crime was unknown, of a people who lived in such complete harmony with their environment that want itself had become merely a historical curiosity. Yet those same scribes, had anyone bothered to ask them, would have struggled to explain why their perfect world felt so much like a tomb. The changes had come gradually, so slowly that most who lived through them barely noticed the transformation. The first generation after the fall of the free peoples had been grateful simply to be alive, to have food and shelter, and the promise that their children would grow up in safety. The second generation, raised in the ordered comfort of the new age, had known no other existence and found nothing strange in a world where every decision was made for them. By the third generation, the very idea of individual choice had begun to seem not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous, a relic of humanity's primitive past that had caused nothing but suffering. Now, in the 8th generation since Weathertop, the transformation was complete. The children who played in the precisely planned parks of the great cities did not run and shout with the wild joy that had once marked the young of every race. Instead, they moved with careful precision, their games following patterns that had been scientifically determined to provide optimal physical and mental development. Their laughter, when it came, was pleasant and well-modulated, never rising to the kind of uncontrolled mirth that might disturb their neighbors' contemplation. In the schools, young minds were shaped, with the same meticulous care that gardeners once devoted to prize roses. Every lesson was carefully calibrated to provide exactly the right amount of knowledge, enough to enable each student to fulfill their assigned role in society, but not so much as to encourage dangerous speculation about alternatives that might exist beyond the boundaries of the known world. History was taught as a progression from chaos to order, from the brutish struggles of the ancient past to the serene perfection of the present day. The great libraries still stood in every major city, their shelves lined with books that chronicled the accumulated wisdom of ages. But the books themselves had been carefully edited, their contents refined to remove any passages that might promote unhealthy thoughts or antisocial tendencies. The poetry still spoke of love, but it was the approved sort of affection that strengthened social bonds rather than the dangerous passion that might lead individuals to place personal desire above communal good. The histories still recorded the deeds of ancient heroes, but those heroes were portrayed as admirable primitives whose noble but misguided individualism had ultimately proven inferior to the collective wisdom of enlightened governance. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the temples. The old gods had not been forbidden or forgotten. Such crude suppression would have been beneath the dignity of the Nine's rule. Instead, they had been refined. Eru Ilúvatar was still worshipped as the creator of all things, but his role as the source of the music of creation had been reinterpreted to emphasize harmony over individual expression. The Valar were honored as wise counselors who had eventually recognized the superiority of the ordered world that the Nine had established. Even the memory of Gandalf was preserved, though he was now remembered as a well-meaning but ultimately misguided figure whose inability to accept the new reality had led to his unfortunate breakdown. In the distant corners of the world, where the authority of the Nine was less directly felt, small communities still existed that maintained some echo of the old ways. But these were increasingly rare, isolated enclaves that survived more through the indifference of their rulers than through any strength of their own. The mountain folk of the Misty Mountains still told stories of the ancient days, but their children listened with the polite attention due to harmless fantasies rather than the eager wonder that had once greeted tales of adventure and heroism. The Shire itself had become something of a historical preserve, its rolling hills maintained in a carefully cultivated state that approximated the pastoral beauty for which it had once been famous. Tourists came from across Middle-earth to see the quaint hobbit holes and sample the traditional ales that were still brewed according to ancient recipes. But the hobbits who served as guides and innkeepers moved through their ancestral homeland like actors playing roles in a pageant, their performances technically perfect, but somehow lacking the essential spark that had once made their people legendary for their joy in simple pleasures. In Bag End, now maintained as a museum dedicated to the primitive period of Hobbit history, visitors could see recreations of how the famous ring-bearer had lived. The guide spoke knowledgeably of Frodo Baggins's tragic end, explaining to wide-eyed children how the poor creature had been driven mad by his burden and had ultimately died trying to accomplish something that was both impossible and unnecessary. They did not mention that in a hidden cellar beneath the museum, accessible only through a passage that no tourist would ever find, a small group of hobbits still gathered on certain nights to remember their own version of the story. These secret gatherings were led by Sam Gamgee's great-great-grandson, a hobbit named Tolman, who had inherited not only his ancestor's name, but something of his stubborn loyalty to memory itself. The stories he told were different from the approved versions, wilder, sadder, shot through with a kind of desperate hope that refused to be extinguished even after 2 centuries of systematic suppression. In his telling, Frodo was not a madman but a hero. The quest was not impossible but merely interrupted, and somewhere beyond the borders of the known world, the light still burned in hearts that had never learned to surrender. "They tell us the age of war is over," Tolman would whisper to his small audience as the autumn wind rattled the shutters of their hidden meeting place. "They tell us that peace has come at last, that all the old struggles have been resolved. But I ask you, what kind of peace is it that requires the death of every dream? What kind of order is it that can only exist when no one dares to ask what lies beyond the hills?" The hobbits who heard these words would nod and murmur their agreement, but they were careful never to speak of such things in the light of day. The consequences of open dissent were not death or imprisonment. Such crude methods had been abandoned long ago. Instead, those who showed signs of social maladjustment were taken to special facilities where they received therapy designed to help them achieve better harmony with their environment. Most who underwent such treatment emerged as model citizens, grateful for the opportunity to contribute more effectively to the common good. They never spoke of what they had experienced, but their eyes held a peculiar emptiness that made their families shudder and look away. Yet even in this world of perfect order and absolute control, there remained pockets of resistance that no amount of therapy could quite eliminate. Deep in the foundations of the old dwarf cities, where the hammers had once rung on anvils and the forges had blazed with eager fire, small groups of craftsmen still gathered to create works that served no practical purpose but their own beauty. Their art was illegal, of course. Individual expression was seen as a form of spiritual selfishness that detracted from collective harmony. But they persisted nonetheless, driven by something in their dwarven nature that refused to be entirely domesticated. In the ruins of the ancient elven realms, where the golden trees had once sung in the wind and the waters had sparkled with captured starlight, rangers still walked paths that existed more in memory than in physical reality. These were not the rangers of old, who had served the kings of men and guarded the borders of civilization. Instead, they were wanderers who served no master but their own need to remember what the world had been before it was perfected. Their very existence was a kind of prayer, a wordless plea to whatever powers might still listen, that not all the beauty of the elder days would be forgotten. But perhaps the strangest of all the hidden communities were the scholars who met in secret to study what they called the lost arts: magic, prophecy, the reading of signs and portents that might hint at possibilities beyond the carefully controlled present. These learned men and women pored over fragments of ancient texts, searching for clues that might suggest their ordered world was not as permanent as it appeared. They spoke in whispers of the music of creation, of themes and variations that had not yet been fully explored, of discord that might yet be transformed into a higher harmony. From beneath the roots of the party tree, where the soil still held the faintest echo of hobbit laughter, and the grass remembered what it felt like to dance in an uncontrolled breeze, a small voice whispered the words that had become both prayer and promise. There and back again, someday. It was a voice that belonged to no living throat, a sound that might have been the wind in the leaves or the settling of old timber, but those few who heard it recognized it for what it was: the dying echo of a world that had been, and perhaps, if the music allowed, the faint prelude to a world that might yet be. The age of unlight stretched on, seemingly eternal in its perfect stagnation. But even in the deepest darkness, even in the most complete silence, the memory of light persisted. And memory, as any student of the old law could have testified, has always been the seed from which new ages grow. In the deepest vaults beneath Barad-dûr, where even the servants of the Nine feared to tread, something stirred that had been sleeping since the foundations of the world were laid. It was not a creature in any sense that mortal minds could comprehend, nor was it precisely a force or power as those terms were commonly understood. Instead, it was something far more fundamental, a resonance, an echo, a single note that had been sounding since the first moment of creation and would continue until the last star guttered out in the cosmic dark. The Witch King felt it as he sat upon his throne of black iron, felt it as a tremor in the perfect order he had spent 3 centuries constructing. For a moment, just a moment, the One Ring grew warm upon his finger, its surface flickering with lights that reminded him, against his will, of stars reflected in moving water. The sensation was brief, barely more than a heartbeat's duration, but it left him with a profound unease that no amount of rational analysis could dispel. "My lord?" The voice belonged to one of his advisors, a man whose family had served the Nine for 7 generations and who had never known any world but the ordered paradise they had created. "Is something troubling you?" The Witch King did not immediately answer. Instead, he rose from his throne and walked to the great window that looked out over his domain. From this height, he could see the vast expanse of Middle-earth spread below him like a map, every road perfectly straight, every city laid out according to mathematical principles, every field and forest arranged to provide maximum efficiency and aesthetic pleasure. It was, by any objective measure, a masterpiece of governance and social engineering. Yet something was wrong. Something was changing. In the farthest corners of his realm, in places so remote that they barely registered on the consciousness of his administrators, small things were beginning to happen that did not fit the established patterns. A flower blooming out of season in a garden where such irregularities had been eliminated centuries ago. A child laughing with a wild joy that no amount of careful upbringing should have allowed. A stream changing its course for no reason that the engineers could identify, flowing suddenly toward the sea instead of the inland reservoirs where its water had been directed for generations. "Send word to the other lords," the Witch King commanded, his voice betraying none of the uncertainty that gnawed at his thoughts. "Tell them to watch for anomalies, disruptions to the established order. Report anything that seems out of place, no matter how trivial it might appear." The advisor bowed and withdrew, but his departure brought the Witch King no relief from his growing disquiet. The One Ring had shown him many things over the years, visions of potential futures, insights into the hidden thoughts of his subjects, glimpses of distant realms that might one day bow to his rule. But it had never shown him this, the slow awakening of something that should have been permanently dormant, a stirring in the very foundations of reality that suggested his perfect world might not be as stable as he had believed. In the hidden chamber beneath the party tree, Tolman Gamgee felt the change as well. The old hobbit was dying, had been dying for months, his body finally succumbing to the weight of years and secret sorrows. But as he lay on his simple bed, surrounded by the few friends who still remembered the old stories, he felt something he had not experienced since childhood. Hope. It came not from any external source, not from news of rescue or rebellion or the return of some long-lost hero. Instead, it rose from within, from some deep well of possibility that he had thought was permanently sealed. The sensation was so unexpected, so utterly at odds with everything he had learned about the nature of their world, that for a moment he wondered if it was merely a hallucination brought on by his approaching death. But then he heard it, faint but unmistakable, carried on a wind that seemed to blow from somewhere beyond the borders of the known world. Music. Not the approved melodies that played in the public squares and concert halls, but something wilder, more complex, shot through with harmonies that spoke of places where individual voices could still rise above the chorus and sing their own unique songs. "Do you hear it?" he whispered to his companions, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own labored breathing. "The music. It's starting again." Some of those gathered around his bedside nodded, their faces bright with wonder and terror in equal measure. Others shook their heads, hearing nothing but the ordinary sounds of night in the Shire. But all of them felt something, a loosening of constraints they had never fully realized existed, a sense that the world had suddenly become larger and more mysterious than they had been taught to believe. Across Middle-earth, in secret places where the light of memory had never been entirely extinguished, similar awakenings were taking place. The dwarfsmiths, deep in their hidden forges, felt their hammers ringing with new rhythms, creating not the practical items their society required, but works of beauty that served no purpose but our own existence. The elf friends, who still walked the empty paths of Lothlorien, found themselves singing songs they did not remember learning, melodies that seemed to spring directly from the earth beneath their feet. Even in the great cities where the rule of the Nine was strongest, change was stirring. Children woke from dreams of green hills and running water, only to find that the images lingered even in the bright light of day. Artists who had spent their lives creating approved works suddenly found their hands moving of their own accord, sketching landscapes that existed nowhere in the carefully mapped world they knew. Musicians discovered new harmonies, hiding in the spaces between familiar notes, chords that seemed to resonate with something deep in the human heart that had long been thought extinct. The Witch King felt each of these small rebellions like needles in his flesh. The one ring grew steadily warmer on his finger, its surface now pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match some cosmic heartbeat. He called upon all his power, all the authority he had accumulated over 3 centuries of absolute rule, and sought to suppress these anomalies before they could spread. But for the first time since claiming the ring, he found his will meeting resistance. It was not the opposition of another conscious mind. He could have crushed any such challenge without effort. Instead, it was something far more fundamental, the resistance of existence itself to the absolute order he had imposed upon it. The music of creation, which he had thought permanently silenced, was beginning to reassert itself in ways that no amount of force could prevent. In the deepest archives of what had once been Rivendell, now converted into a museum of primitive elvish culture, a single book fell open on a page that had not been read for centuries. The words written there glowed faintly in the darkness, their meaning clear despite the passage of years. And it is said among the wise that ere the end of all things, when the last note of the music fades and the final theme is resolved, there shall come a new song, not a repetition of what was, but a continuation, a development of themes only hinted at in the original creation. This new music shall be sung not by the Ainur alone, but by all the children of Ilúvatar, each voice adding its own unique harmony to the eternal symphony. The book closed itself after a moment, but the words lingered in the air like incense, carrying with them a promise that no power, however absolute, could permanently forestall. Somewhere in the vast machinery of the ordered world, a gear had slipped out of alignment. Somewhere in the perfect silence that the Nine had created, a single voice had begun to sing. The Witch King rose from his throne and walked to the highest balcony of Barad-dûr, where he could look out over all the lands that acknowledged his sovereignty. The view was unchanged, still perfectly ordered, still utterly peaceful, still testament to the beneficent wisdom of his rule. But now he could sense the music that was beginning to rise from that ordered landscape, could feel the stirring of possibilities that he had thought permanently eliminated. For the first time in 3 centuries, the master of Middle-earth felt something that he had not experienced since his days as a mortal king: uncertainty. The world was changing, evolving, growing beyond the boundaries he had so carefully established. And somewhere in that change, in that slow awakening of forces that had slumbered through the long age of his dominion, he sensed the presence of something that might yet prove stronger than his will. The One Ring pulsed on his finger like a captive heart, its light now bright enough to be seen from the streets far below. In that light, for just a moment, the Witch King saw not his perfectly ordered realm, but something else entirely, a vision of what Middle-earth might become if the music were allowed to resume its interrupted song. It was a future he had never imagined, a possibility that both terrified and strangely attracted him. And thus ends the tale that never was, yet always could be. For darkness never truly dies. It only waits for the world to forget the sound of the song. But songs, once begun, have a way of continuing even when their singers fall silent. In the deepest places of the world, in the hidden chambers of the heart, in the spaces between one breath and the next, the music endures. And perhaps, in some far dawn that neither prophecy nor vision can foresee, the themes that were silenced at Weathertop might yet find their voice again, adding their own unique harmonies to the eternal symphony that began before time and will continue long after the last star has faded from the sky. The wheel turns, the music plays, and hope, however small, however hidden, endures. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.